Welcome to Authenticate This, the cybersecurity leadership podcast for CISOs and identity leaders navigating the complex world of identity. From real-life breaches to internal missteps and everything in between, we bring you authentic stories, hard-earned lessons, and actionable insights to help you lead with confidence when chaos strikes. Our goal is to humanize identity, uncover actionable solutions, and explore the business of identity beyond the spreadsheet. This is Authenticate This, where identity meets leadership.
Hey, I'm Aaron Lentz, and this is Tim York. Welcome to Authenticate This. Today we've got Scott on the call. Scott comes from currently at SPS Commerce as the CISO. He was at Medtronic for 20 years. He's done a lot. So when I talked to the guy before, he's super busy. But one of the most interesting things I found about Scott, in addition to being a founding member of the Minnesota CISO chapter, is that Scott is an ice fisher. I didn't know what that was from Texas. I looked it up, and one of the funniest things I found was like people learn to stop ice fishing when they hear on the news that the season's over because somebody fell through the ice. Scott, I was wondering if you could just tell me a little bit about yourself, but also include a little bit more about this ice fishing to a guy from Texas.
Yeah, thanks, Aaron. Like you said, I'm CISO at SPS Commerce. I've been here a little over a year and a half now, but spent a large majority of my career before that at Medtronic, and enjoyed my time there, enjoyed the medtech space, but I'm having a lot of fun in the SaaS software space now as well. And yeah, like you said, for those not in the upper Midwest, ice fishing is a bit of a strange novelty. We do literally walk out on the frozen lakes or rivers or streams or drive out even in some cases and head on out to the middle of the water and then poke holes in what should be liquid and hope not to fall through. And yes, unfortunately, there are some people, not me, who like to push it early and push it late and often wind up in the news with their cars falling through. You see some entertaining pictures every fall or early winter and early spring with some cars sticking out of the water, sticking out of the ice a little bit. And fun fact, you have to pay for that to have it removed, or you get fined and you have to pay the cost of having it removed later. So,
okay. So we need to like invest in some of those like floating boat cars. You got an extra alternative there.
One of the UTVs or whatever, so that it's good on all terrain.
What makes people do that? It's like, aren't the fish dormant, or maybe they're not dormant up there? Like they're dormant in Texas in the winter for the most part, or get closer to dormant.
Yeah, they get quieter for sure. It depends on what sort of species you're fishing for, but it's a culture, it's a community. I would say honestly, most people use it as a getaway. They go out, hang out with some buddies, sit around, have some beverages, and enjoy just hanging out. And you can do it unattended in a lot of cases. You set up and you drop a line in the hole and you can hang out and chat and talk with your friends or play some games. I've spent some overnights on the ice actually in a trailer cabin gadget that has a stove and a microwave and a TV and heat. And it's like being in a hotel, but you're fishing right there in your room as well and playing board games and watching movies. And so it's just it gets cold here in the winter. We need to find things we can still do and get out of our houses as well.
That's fascinating, man. That's way cool.
I love watching you talk about that. I feel like it's such a Minnesota thing. The best people I know are from Minnesota. There's a few people in our industry, shout out to Mike Quinn and to Pete Peterson within our industry, but those guys grew up in Minnesota. And when they talk about it, just like you, it's like sense of nostalgia. Like it's their time with their friends and their buddies. It's almost like if we do our summer a golf trip with the boys where, you go on out but it's what you do in the winter. Absolutely love that. Very cool. Let's go ahead and jump into a couple things. We typically go through a few articles and Not the Onion that are identity related that happened in the last 30 days or so, which is interesting. I have a few of those, but I also have some really interesting breach data that was released in April, kind of some of the big breaches that were announced or released in April. So let's start with Not the Onion. This article scares me, but here's the title of the article. And this is the organization name, Regeneron, okay? Mind you, the name ends with Enron. Regeneron agrees to buy bankrupt 23andMe, promises ethical use of customers' DNA info or data. That's the article. And then full disclosure, I was just looking for the article titles. I go to look to read it and there was a paywall. They wanted me to pay to read the article. So I didn't read the article, but there's a reason it's in Not the Onion. Again, it shocked me. It ended in Enron, But 23andMe, for those of you who don't know, is a service that you would take a DNA sample. I believe it was probably a swab, a mouth swab. I did one of 23andMe competitors, Ancestry.com, where you do a mouth swab, they have your DNA, and they give you some really cool data, but also some kind of scary data. And so I guess the question to you, Scott, but from the eyes or the lens of a CISO, if this was your data, if you were a consumer of 23andMe, would you be concerned here?
I advised everyone that I knew actually when it came out that 23andMe was going out of business or was going bankrupt and was going to be up for sale. I advised them all to go out and do the delete action. You could request to have your data removed. Obviously, there's not 100% certainty, but they did have a process for that, to have it removed and to have your samples destroyed if they had not. I think that's one of the risks with biometric data, especially, is that it's immutable, right? It doesn't change, it lasts forever, and it's yours. And I think anytime that sort of ownership of that changes hands, it's a risk. And I don't know, I'm a security guy. Paranoia is my gig, right? But the regen part of the new buyer's name makes me think something nefarious is going to happen, and we're going to see a cloned Tim York out there in the world here in the coming years. But so for me personally, that's what I would have done. I would have requested my data be deleted until I have a little better running history of what this new company is and how they're really going to handle it. There's been a big population of people that have used those services like Ancestry, like 23andMe, and certainly not everyone has the same risk tolerance that maybe I do either.
Yeah. It's funny that you picked up on the regen part of the name. I picked up on the other part of the name. Too bizarre.
One thing to add to that's going to be interesting, one of Gartner's, they do these predictions for what happens in the next 10 years. One of Gartner's predictions is something like, I think it's by 2035, that there will be an official identity marketplace, which I did not know what that meant at first. What they're suggesting is that people will be able to buy and sell identity data from a government sources in a more official way. So like this, in this case, you could sell your DNA samples as part of your identity data. You can put that on and somebody will get a cut for being the reseller. But that's fascinating to me. I don't understand how that marketplace works, because so much of this data is out there already. But I don't know, Scott, what you think about this idea of buying and selling your own personal identity data to other businesses.
It confuses me a bit as well, Aaron, but I think if at least you have the control as an individual and control of your own data, then you can make a decision. Now, obviously, the risk with that is that not everybody is going to be well informed about the potential consequences of doing so.
Right.
Just like in business, our goal is to make sure that the right people understand the risk. It seems like it's ripe for abuse and misuse as well. At least if we're trying to put the power in the hands of the people who should rightfully own the data, we're on the right track. There's an opportunity there that could be a lead towards doing something more organized from a national identity perspective, which maybe that's where that's leading. I'm not sure I would start with the biometric elements, but hey, if we start doing something beyond social security number, then we're headed down the right track.
Very interesting. Actually, before we move on from that, the advice that you gave was really good advice to anyone on 23andMe. Is that still valid advice? Is that still something they can do? Or was there a timeline that needed to complete that delete by?
I'm not 100% sure. I don't know the answer to that question, Tim. I know I may have, if the deal has gone through, it may have expired, but I know that at least initially and early on, that was still a very valid request.
Maybe we'll look that up and we'll put a link in when we post this podcast, just in case. Cool. Let's move on to the next article. And this one, we don't need to dig in too much, but it highlights something really interesting about people's identities and what data and what things are important from an identity level and how we identify. And so here's the article title: Outrage in Brazil over new red national football jersey. And a lot of the outrage, to be honest, once I read through the article, a lot of it was politically oriented, but it really came down to this deep desire. Obviously, football, soccer or American football is not the same as football, but football, soccer in Brazil is part of their culture, part of their identity. And it's deep in their national colors, green, yellow, and blue on their jerseys that are iconic, are like deep and meaningful. Like these people are passionate about their national colors. And so just a thing like changing it to red really influenced and angered a whole bunch of people. But it really shows our identity, what data is actually important to us. And you can look at it from the outside and say, it's just a color, it's just a jersey. It seems so simple, but it's not so simple, is it?
No, it's not. I was thinking about that as you go through, and it's a cultural identity, right? You think about it, I'll apply it to us here in the United States. If they suddenly said our colors weren't going to be red, white, and blue, right? And they said we're going to wear green jerseys in the Olympics, we'd all be throwing our hands up in the air, questioning that too. What do you mean? Our colors have been red, white, and blue forever. And so we have this cultural identity formed as a nation around that. And it's the same in Brazil, right? Yeah, when you first started, I was thinking, I'm like, red? What do you mean red? Everybody knows the green and yellow and blue of Brazil. And that's, it's maybe one of the few countries where everybody can recite that off the top of their head. So there is definitely a connection to that there. So it seems obvious, but like any community culture, your identity is formed sometimes officially, but sometimes unofficially around things as well. And I would argue that was a pretty official, cultural identifier for Brazil and their community or football. And whereas other cultural identifiers might not be as unique, they might have a community that just engages in different ways as well. But yeah, it's an interesting one. Understanding how a community identifies itself and what's culturally significant to them is sometimes more nuanced than we might like to think.
Yeah. Do you think that plays into at a smaller level with the organizations that we support, those cultural identity players, like they really play into kind of how we make decisions at the business level?
Oh, it absolutely does. Your culture and how you identify yourself. I've worked in multiple businesses now that have done a lot of acquisitions. And you find these things really quickly as you go in and you're working with a new company or a new part of your business that has very different cultural norms or cultural identifiers, the things that they really hang their hat on as a part of their culture that maybe are different than what the acquiring company's culture is. And it's always a weird sort of little give and take balance and trying to figure out what's it look like then going forward as we meld these cultures and try to become one team, so to speak. But usually if it's something you're acquiring, it's for a reason. And there was value there in their business and their culture that's a part of their business. And you're trying to figure out how to try to blend those things into what your business is without losing the magic that made it what it is. And at the same time, sometimes change is necessary. So it is a delicate dance to understand it. And I think it is important to spend some time and understand it and understand what made it unique and what made it special, and think about being intentional in terms of how you bring those things together as you go forward.
So you spent 20 years at Medtronic, which means you had to be not just part of the night, just like understand the culture, but you were part of the culture being there for so long and helping establish it. How, with whatever you're willing to share, like what was it like switching to a new company and much less switching to a new company as a CISO, somebody who really influences culture? What was that like? Was there a lot of similarities in the culture, or were there some just things that you went home at night as, oh shit, I got to change how I work a little bit because the culture is different?
Yeah. Yeah. Very different cultures, right? So Medtronic, super long-lived company, right? Where I think 75 years now, but size and scale is just dramatically different there too. You're talking about 120,000 employees, $40 billion in revenue, global multinational organization, and probably tilted a little bit more traditional conservative in their culture, right? And not surprisingly, when you have an older, large company, that tends to be the case. Versus switching to SPS, smaller organization, not new, but younger in comparison to Medtronic. And you're jumping down to an organization that's 3,000 people and is a software company, is a very different culture than a med tech company, right? Your risk tolerance is very different. Your sort of go-to-market attitude and approach is very different. We're thinking a little bit differently about how we move and how our agility shows up in the organization. And being a software first company is very different than being a health tech company. And as I onboarded, thankfully, it was not a super difficult transition. But yeah, you had to figure out what's the pace of change, what's expected in terms of the pace of change, what's expected, what are the cultural norms in terms of how leaders engage, how leaders interact, what's the political landscape like, if you will. Or I would say in comparison, SPS is less political than maybe Medtronic was. Also, I would say typical of just the difference. And so jumping to that, but just understanding that what's normal and having to feel that out over the first few months, even of being here, and even 20 years versus a year and a half. I don't have all the culture figured out at SPS yet either, but we're still working on it.
That's crazy. Just because it's funny to think we're talking about like Brazil and just in the like a culture there versus there's our individual cultures of who we are, where we're from, then our work cultures and how those influences our family cultures. So you've got to learn about, I'm sure, those your other influencers in your organization, what influences them so that you can start to work with them. And that just takes a lot of time and generally takes building of trust. So it sounds like for this role as CISO, because I've seen CISOs come in and they're just like, okay, to make positive change, they've got to be a little bit disruptive early on. And that just works in some situations. And then in other situations, it sounds like at SPS, you might need to slow roll it a little bit, understand who's who and what's what to make sure you don't step on any toes.
I think it's more for me personally, stylistically, and as a leadership choice, I very intentionally prefer to learn and observe and listen and try to get to at least a baseline understanding before I start thinking about making too much change. There might be smaller things early on, but I think, especially if you're coming in to lead an existing team, I think it's super important that you try to connect with what is and what exists today, and at least a little bit of the why, because the team that's here today is connected to that work. They've been a part of it. They've created it. They've implemented it, whatever it might be, right? They've lived it, and understanding what is and why is a really important part of creating the culture in your organization and creating sort of your leadership brand as you engage in a new organization, and really demonstrating that interest and caring in the people and the organization as a whole. I think it can be a little too traumatic, and can cause maybe too much disconnect from the team and the people if you create too much change right away. I've been parts of organizations that have done that before, and unfortunately, my experience was that it just led to a lot of disengagement from the people who ultimately need to change and need to carry it forward, because I can introduce change. I very rarely can enact change, right? I'm not going to be the one that has to carry it forward and really execute it all. Everybody else does. And so I need them engaged. I need alignment. I need understanding in order for that change to go forward and be effective. And if I don't understand what is and why, then it's really hard to do that.
That's really cool. I think part of the reason why I like what's really attractive about the way you're saying is you're talking about these different individuals and what drives them. I hear in the last few years, it's not just our own industry, but many industries are using the culture concept as a buzzword. And often it's just a general descriptor of an organization or of a situation, or an excuse of why they can't do something as culture, versus understanding what definition of a culture really means. And then how does that apply to both the larger group and then individual groups, and how do they interact with each other? So I really like the way you're approaching it, Scott, as for beyond just using it as these normal buzzwords and talking more about like community and individuals. So that's cool stuff.
What I heard there, Scott and Aaron, was that when you were saying, hey, I want to find out the why, you wanted to understand your people's purpose and what they were trying to accomplish. And then you said, we need alignment. You align to their purpose. And so when a team and an environment is aligned on a purpose, that's a powerful team. And that's when the team really starts to perform. And I love that you said it differently, but understanding the why. And by the way, it's no secret. I love Simon Sinek. He's one of my favorite authors, and understanding and finding your why is really important. And that's one of my favorite books, and it has been for 15 years since it came out. So I love that. Thanks for that, Scott.
I think there's a lot of also just lost in jumping in too quickly. There's a lot of, there are too many assumptions, right? You lose on some of the history that can be valuable in understanding what's happened. Like, it may not be a reason to stay the same, but it can be very informative about how we got here. And it can tell you, especially as you're new to an organization, it can tell you a lot about the culture that is. It can tell you a lot about the people that are around, whether in and outside your organization, the operating mechanisms of the company. You can gain a lot of insight by understanding how you got where you are. And then it helps you understand how to tell the story the right way to influence change. It's too abrupt. I find it too abrupt, at least, to walk in the door, assume I know what's best, and start telling everybody we need to change. That's just not my style.
Love that. Love that. That was a great talk track, by the way, all around Brazilian jerseys.
Yeah, we went all over the place.
For the last and final, we don't need to spend as much time on this. It's more of a comic relief, but we should actually dig in a little bit. So here's the title. EU fines the EU for breaching data protection law. And it's funny seeing that. They find themselves for breaching the law that they created. But if you really think about the organizations that we work in and support are always doing this, right? We're fighting each other internally on laws that were rules or policies we're creating. I don't know if you have a thought on that. Yeah, the EU fined itself on breaching its own law.
My first two thoughts on that, Tim, were one, good to see them holding themselves accountable. Great. Consistency and uniformity is excellent to see when you sometimes you feel like you're singled out. Also, maybe my first thought was actually probably, yeah, even they don't understand what they wrote. A little bit of that. Even they don't know how to comply with it. So sometimes I think that's one of the challenges, especially as you think about data protection laws, right? And there's a lot of similarities, but there are also some differences, and there's a lot of nuance, and there's a lot of individual regulations to figure out and comply with, especially as you start going global, right? And figuring out how you do that effectively is not an easy task for any large organization.
Yeah. And just as a little plug on that note, IC Console, where Aaron and I work for IC Console, we're headquartered in Germany. We're all over Europe. We're in Asia. We're in North America. But that's actually one of our value propositions to our customers is we've got people on the street, in market, in country that are complying to and understand those local data privacy laws. And there's actual real value to organizations that have needs in those countries. So that's actually, you're right. It's extremely difficult to understand and you've got to stay on top of it. And once you're on top of it, you got to continue every 30, 60 days just to make sure, continue education because it's constantly changing. I love it.
I think, Tim, that would be hugely valuable I don't know if it's a success or a failure story, but in my previous life at Medtronic, it took me probably close to 5 years or the better part of 5 years to get DLP deployed in Europe because you have to navigate each country's individual data protection laws, their privacy requirements, their employment labor laws that come into tie into those things, and having looks like I should have found a better partner to help me navigate some of those and figure out how to work through the process, because that was an exceptionally challenging process, especially in a subset of the countries. Some that you mentioned even.
Yeah. Okay. Thanks for that. All right, let's jump over to some of the April breaches that were announced. There's some interesting trends. And of course, it's just the month of April, so it's hard to really say this is a big trend, but it is some of the trends that happened. So in April, there were a lot of healthcare organizations that announced breaches. You got Yale, you got Blue Shield, and then a handful of others that represented tens of millions of identities. And what was really interesting, they identified two things that were happening in these healthcare organizations. One was ransomware. That was the biggest one. But the second was misconfiguration is what they announced. And I'm assuming I'm making some assumptions on that, but I don't know what your thoughts are. First of all, 4, 5, 6 years ago, ransomware wasn't a real thing and deepfakes weren't really a real thing yet, but they are becoming. And one of the healthcare breaches was also a deepfake. And so I don't know if you have thoughts on those three items: ransomware, misconfigurations, and deepfakes, specifically in the healthcare industry, coming from Medtronic for 20 years.
Yeah, I think, having come from Medtronic, right, I think it's not new that healthcare records, if that's what were stolen, actually carry more value on the black market than a credit card or some other things. The attractiveness of an individual health record is not new. We were talking about that a decade ago, probably. In terms of the more lucrative target there. And until maybe recently, even, it's fair to say that healthcare was a laggard in terms of security maturity. I think That's flipped a little bit over the last handful of years, which is fabulous because it is a critical part of our infrastructure, but they were slow to catch up on it. And I think, it's not surprising to me that ransomware and misconfiguration are the top. Those continue to be the top for almost everybody. And so a lot of times ransomware comes as a result of a misconfiguration or as a result of a phishing or something like that. Those I think are the top of my list of risks here in SPS Commerce as well. And so it's not surprising. That's the what, and understanding the why is sometimes interesting, right? So what's a value? How might that be used by a bad actor to actually get what they want or to take advantage of your organization? So understanding what's valuable to you and where that might be applied is maybe even more interesting than understanding the specific. What are they going to do? Yeah, we all know they're going to do phishing, they're going to do ransomware, they're going to take advantage of misconfiguration. Those things are obvious, right? Anybody in the industry knows that. I think that the deepfake thing is super interesting, right? And I think it's even maybe a little broader. It's not quite a deepfake, but I'd say you probably all also heard there's a lot of voice phishing.
Yeah.
Right? I don't know the number of attacks that have happened of late. I've seen a lot of them and a lot of discussion on it that have happened because a bad actor contacted the help desk from some company and impersonated somebody and got their credentials reset and got in, right? This isn't a new attack vector either. I managed a help desk in another lifetime, right? We were talking about that there. How do you know the person it's calling is actually who they say they are? Identity verification has been a tricky subject for a long time, and AI has just made it more difficult, right? Because you can do voice impersonation, you can do video. Think about the number of articles that you've maybe seen in the last few months or year on some state actors that are placing workers, right? Tech workers in companies around the world. I think we've all seen that. North Korea has been the subject of a lot of those, but there have been some pretty major breaches and theft activities that have come as a result of that. And it's a wild activity to think about it. And a lot of times they are using some sort of video deepfake technology to help get through the interview process and get onboarded. But that is, I think with AI in general, that is one of my bigger concerns over time is just authenticity. It's authentication. If you can connect it back to an identity topic, right? It's authentication and understanding how do you know what you're seeing is real.
Mm.
And we haven't answered that yet for some of the newer technologies that have come out. We still struggle with it for basics.
Yeah.
Right? Taking it on to the new generation is going to be a challenge.
I totally agree there. Okay, so the other trend, there were 3 more breaches that were announced. Some big names. So Hertz, Car Rental, WW Kellogg, and Verisource. And the vulnerability there, or the issue that they at least released, was with a third-party vendor, specifically Clio. But I'm sure there's going to be more. We're going to see more of that. But third-party vendors is probably the other big one when you said, hey, we're used to these types of breaches, but third-party vendors is the other way. What's your thoughts on that or experience there?
I think just about everybody I've ever talked to struggles to just get their arms around their third parties. I think even understanding your third party landscape is difficult. And in an organization of any size, it's a struggle because they can and do show up from everywhere. It's smaller organizations have a lot more flexibility to bring in partners and vendors and buy things. Larger organizations, there are just so many people and pockets and groups that it's hard to really trust that. And so that continues to be a struggle in terms of even understanding the scope you're dealing with, let alone then asserting any sort of influence over what that third party is doing and how you manage them. I think we're seeing everybody's talking about it, and we're seeing some big names in the industry really trying to assert some influence on that, and a positive, but it's not without difficulty either. So Amazon, as an example, has been pretty aggressively working with their third parties that connect into their Amazon.com selling infrastructure and trying to help.
Right.
Right. Yeah. Just a few. And which is great to see Amazon taking a leadership position in that. But you're also dealing with every small business in the world that is selling on Amazon. So their ability to meet that expectation and meet that requirement is not always the same. I do think there's going to be some need to have some more enforcement around third parties and some better way to enforce requirements, but that has to start from within the company, right? And actually having at least a little bit of authority to have contractual requirements around third party security, have technical controls in place with things even like SCIM integration from an identity perspective, right? So that we can actually leverage the technologies that we've had available for years, but actually use them effectively to manage access and manage roles. Because so much of the third party risk comes from access in some way, right? Again, back to identity, because everything is always back to identity. And managing that access and controlling what they have access to continues to be a challenge, whether you're talking about a third party or your internal resources.
It's interesting that you brought up SCIM. I know we talked in the past about that, and we talked about in the future, what would your future desire be? And you talked about adoption of standards. You mentioned a handful, but SCIM was one of those. Let's go down that path a little bit. If you could grab your magic crystal ball and look into the future, what would you like to see and what do you expect to see?
I think it's that interoperability integration. So whether or not, and that often is coming through standards adoption, right? Whether it's things like SCIM or OAuth or OIDC in the IAM world, and really getting our partners and tools in the ecosystem to work together. It's the same problem we have across security and across a lot of technology, but it's that interoperation that's difficult. I remember back in a different time, I used to hassle our friends at Microsoft because they had great technologies that worked fabulously together if you were in a homogeneous Microsoft ecosystem, which nobody was. That just wasn't the reality of how business ever operated. And that interoperability, integration of data, and that's why you're seeing, think about the big platform pushes that you've seen across the security industry over the last handful of years, right? Because nobody can figure out how to get all their tools to work together effectively. So you have to look at something to collapse them into a single platform. Yes, maybe there's a savings play, but there's also an efficacy play if you're trying to get the systems to work together, actually communicate effectively, share information, and give you actually meaningful visibility in some way. You need that interoperability. Unfortunately, people aren't incentivized to do it, understandably, right? People are selling products and services and tools, and they're not necessarily incentivized to make it easier to connect them together and work with others that aren't their platform. So I get that, right? We're all here to make money in our businesses. But if we truly want to make a difference in our security world, I think that's going to have to happen. I think, Tim, you asked, what do I actually think is going to happen? I do think we are seeing, at least in some areas, more push towards those standards. There have been some good organizing bodies. I think even not exactly security related, but if you look at the IoT world and all the different orchestration engines and standards that were out there around IoT, and then the big players, a lot of them got together and really aligned around Matter and the Matter standard, and essentially now requiring that anything that's going to go to market and work in their IoT ecosystem has to work with Matter, right? Which really then does help unify it in a consumer ecosystem. And so we need to get that same level of alignment and organizational firepower, if you will, and industry firepower behind those standards to make us all work together.
I like that idea of the firepower piece, because when you talk about some of those other areas, so like IoT, but other areas of the business, a lot of times those areas are driving revenue and they're buying platforms that drive revenue. And so the revenue generating platforms usually talk to each other because that's what's making the money. In our space and anything inside of security, it feels like we need to become more and more of that in the business of making the company money, not just cost savings, but building in efficiencies that allow for that. Because even when you talk about some of those breaches, we're talking about healthcare. We're talking about that early on. The first breach that you were talking about was 3 different healthcare companies. A lot of those, the systems that either make, especially like in hospitals, money, or support the applications that host client patient data, are often on old systems. So they've been developed by this product company, but they're still all on Windows 7 machines. Not now, but they're on old machines, right? Because it takes so long to do all the upgrades. They've got to rebuild their whole platform to work on the next version of an operating system. And so you run into that stuff where you're not making money by doing an upgrade, but those systems still talk to each other in healthcare. But we and security are still stuck working with old systems that have no interoperability between each other, have no standards. We have to then go collect data and do a bunch of funky stuff. And then we go into the misconfiguration stuff that Tim brought up earlier too, where you run into whoever did that magic to make things work has left, and they were doing something crazy. So there's always something wrong in there. And so it's interesting, Scott, that you talk about it that way, that we do need to have that driver in our industry to make things happen, not just within our security industries, but with other application, like third-party software developers, to be able to follow those same standards. I don't know how to start that and to get them doing that, because a lot of times when you ask one of these third-party vendors, hey, I need OAuth, they're like, cool, we can develop it for you, but you're going to pay us to develop it. You're like, but that's not like you're going to sell this to everybody. All of your customers need this. I don't know, Scott, but do you have any ideas of where to start something like that, other than just building out our community and getting CISOs to raise their hand, push for it?
I'm not sure if I do, and I hesitate to say this, but I do think in some degree the SEC regulation around breach disclosure that came out last year, or what was it, 23, was a step in the right direction. And so I'm not one to ever assume that our government is going to help us solve all of our problems. But if you think about even just going back to financial transparency and financial regulation, right? Tim, you joked about Enron earlier, right? We had that connection, so we'd come full circle.
Yeah.
Right? Enron was part of what burst the regulations we have, like SOX, that really drove all of the financial transparency and regulation that we have today. And I'm hesitant. I'm hoping that we don't have to have something so significant like Enron or WorldCom or one of those. Or maybe you would argue that we already have had those from a security perspective, and we're just overlooking it. Asserting some sort of actual regulatory requirements on companies, I think, is a good driver for aligning some of those things. Now, obviously, that was about breach disclosure, but as you pull the thread on that, it goes upstream to reducing risk, right? And reducing the chances that I'm going to have to actually have something to disclose. And I think that was, while it was imperfect, I do think it was a step in the right direction in terms of bringing some of that authority and some of that consistency, at least across the US, where a lot of other countries, for that matter, already have some more stringent requirements.
Right. It certainly brought validity to a lot of the guesstimates of how many breaches were happening. As these breach reports come out, you're like, oh, okay. You just read off 6 in April. There's way more than that all the time, constantly getting breaches. And so the ease of that, a lot of it has to do with individual humans and complexity of their jobs, and security not being the priority part of their job. And I would argue shouldn't be for a lot of people. So I'd be interested to see where it goes. And when we talk about some of those regulations, how some of them can bring us in towards the right direction. So you brought up SOX, for example. It's not the only one, but we get lots of things like user access reviews. They get brought up and pushed in. And
Okay, not my favorite example, Aaron, but I'll let it go.
Oh, let's talk about that. So what's the value to user access reviews? And is there one? There was one, I would say, early on, but is there one at the cost of what it takes of our business to do a user access review?
This is probably a soapbox item for me, but I rant about user access reviews semi-regularly. I think we all understand the spirit of it, right? The fundamental question of ensuring who has access to what and whether or not they should. And fundamentally, that's one of those IAM questions that we've been trying to answer effectively for years.
Make it sound like monks. Bro, just sit and think about.
Well, ultimately, if you think about it, that's what we're trying to do, right? We're trying to make sure the right people have access to the right things at the right time for the right reasons, right? That's the generic IAM definition. And we put these regulations in place, and early on, even with SOX, right? I remember going through, and you had to show the access requests, and you had to show approvals, and you had to show these, and then it trimmed back in a lot of cases to just access reviews. And somebody that goes in and says, yep, Aaron should have access and should have that access, I approve. right? But in practice, it doesn't actually have a meaningful impact on security risk in most organizations. Some places, maybe, but if you think about the dynamic of an access review and what you're asking, right? And so usually maybe you're asking the manager, maybe you're asking a role owner, maybe you're asking an application owner to take a look and say, Aaron and Tim have these roles in this system. Is that accurate? You think about where the risk is to an action there, right? And the risk in most of those scenarios is in saying no. The immediate risk, right? The immediate risk in saying no is you might break something for Aaron or Tim that they need to do their job. Right. And so as a manager, especially, right, managers that look and say, I don't know, if Aaron's got that, I assume he needs it. He's got to do his job. I don't want to risk his ability to do his job effectively. And so for me, the immediate risk is in breaking your ability to do your job. It's not in maybe somebody's going to compromise Aaron's credentials and do something that they shouldn't because he has access to it. Right. So there's a sort of cost benefit there that doesn't line up with the actual action that we're asking people to do. And it's not an easy problem. And we've fought with this for years in IAM, right? With things like role-based access and attribute-based access and AI/ML trying to help us understand why Aaron the only person in his team that has this access, which I do think is helpful. It adds value if you can bring some context into those interactions and into those equations to help somebody make a decision. It does. But until we can find a better way to make it so that the risk equation is more meaningfully not in breaking something that we need the employee to do to be productive, I think we're going to continue to struggle with actually getting the intended outcome from that action.
Because we talked about culture earlier. I feel like access reviews create either most often a culture of fear. Like you say, I don't know what I'm doing. And so I'm afraid to mess something up. Also, if I don't do it right, I'm going to get in trouble for it because it's getting audited. And I don't want it to come back to me in 6 months that I granted or allowed somebody to continue access. And then it starts, and for those who get real nervous about it all, it starts at the granting of access. So when somebody starts, I don't know what access they should have to do their jobs. And so they're afraid they can't. So they give them all the access, or they're afraid they're going to give them too much. So they don't give them enough. And it takes weeks for people to get started on their jobs, which make people feel like the new hire feel like they're not providing value for their new job. I think that we talked about this on a podcast before. People get worried about this giant life change that they made for their family culture, right? And they're coming in, I just made this giant life change. I can't do my job because I don't have the access. My boss doesn't know. I'm trying to build a relationship with my boss. And so all that hurts through the process. And I think it circles back to what we talked about earlier is these applications. If the three of us got together and there was a new application that was coming out as identity professionals, we could go in and build and say, here's the authentication standards you need to have. And what's more, here's what fine-grained authorization should look like in its simplest way. It's very complex for every application, but here's a set of standards and formulas and a tiered model that maybe allows for roles that you use for this application. And here's the one, and here's the risk levels for each one. And here's the amount of privilege to each one. If you have that privilege, if one of those sets of roles has a privilege, it's a SOX permission. I don't need to regulate or review all of them. That one's a SOX permission. And I can tell the manager or whoever's requesting the stuff. So to me, it really stems at the application level. And we've got so many applications in an environment that it grows a fear culture out of identity that should have never been there to begin with.
Well, especially when you think about the growth and explosion of SaaS and SaaS applications as a SaaS provider, right? That's what our business does. But you think about it and you say authorization and where we store and manage that authorization when you think about the SaaS landscape is almost always within the application, right? You go way back and it used to be all Active Directory based or heavy Active Directory based, right? And you could do it all. Your applications understood how to talk to Active Directory and you could use groups and things like that. And a lot of your SaaS applications don't really support an effective way for fine-grained authorization, at least, done out of the application. So then you have this disparate world also of all of your authorization is distributed within the applications. And so if somebody comes and says, hey, what does Aaron have access to? And answering that question is exceptionally difficult. Simple question that all of us in IAM would really love to be able to answer in a finger snap. And we almost always flail about going, well, I can tell you what I can tell you. I can tell you maybe at the authentication level, coarse grain, I can give you at least some indication. Then below detail, I think continues to elude us in most of the cases, with some exceptions. There are organizations that are great at this. They've made the investment, right? They've dug into it, but it takes a lot.
You mean like a new company who only has 2 applications?
Probably, yeah.
Okay. To make sure we're on the same page.
Although no, probably not, because then just everybody has access to everything, and it's because there's only a few. It's fine.
The CEO, owner, also the DBA, all the same person just says approve.
Right.
Done.
You mentioned some challenges earlier with regulations or lack of regulations. What other political challenges or current environment challenges are you dealing with at the CISO level?
Yeah, I think if I think about it from a privacy perspective, I think the lack of any sort of real privacy regulation from a national perspective continues to present challenges. And even if we say a world where we had a US one, the global landscape around privacy continues to be challenging and navigating that. So that certainly is one. I think speaking of those SEC regulations and others, I think the landscape for CISO liability is concerning to most of us in my role. And there were some notable events, right? SolarWinds, right? They jumped CISO in and we're trying to hold him personally liable. And so the conversation around covered in directors and officers, insurance policies for your business and things like that. But it's quieted a little bit, but I would say that continues. There's a little bit of an undercurrent, if you will, of concern from CISOs about being held personally liable for decisions that are made, which feels a little disingenuous when we all know that basically there's never a decision that's solely mine, right? If we're making risk decisions, could be the wrong decision, but it's not typical that I've made that on my own or completely in a vacuum. And those are some of the, I think, prevailing regulatory concerns or challenges that are out there. Yeah, those are the ones that kind of jump top to mind, at least.
Okay, very cool. I have one more interesting thing I want to run by you. I'm actually very curious your response on this. So our audience for this podcast is, let's call it about 70% security professionals, many of which are executive level, kind of your peers within the industry, but also a lot of them are trying to grow up within the industry and they're looking to CISOs like you for advice on how to do things. The next 20 to 25% of our audience is vendors, manufacturers within the identity space. And it makes sense, right? We're broadcasting this podcast through many venues, but I think the biggest avenue of audience is coming from LinkedIn on the from a professional environment. So it makes sense that a lot of manufacturers are seeing it, like vendors that are trying to sell to you, Scott. And I'm getting a lot of people reaching out saying, oh, you're talking to this CISO or that CISO. Can you make a connection? And of course, obviously we're going to protect those relationships and not make those connections. But I did want to talk to you about your expectation and desire. Like, obviously it's part of your job to communicate and collaborate with these vendors and the manufacturers and even systems integrators like us, like IC Console. You have to deal with us because we're the ones that deploy your products or sell you the products that you need to do your job or partially to do your job. So how do you prefer to deal with vendors and how would you prefer they communicate and collaborate and talk with you? I'm just curious at your level there.
The first thing that jumped to mind there, Tim, I don't like to be sold. I find my most meaningful partnerships have come from people that I've just built a relationship with, a professional, and sometimes developed into a personal relationship with, in terms of just partnering together, sharing information, collaborating, whether they can bring some interesting solutions to bear to help educate me in some cases, but just to actually be a partner, what I would consider a true partner, and not just selling me something. I would say I've backed away from some relationships very consistently, actually, probably when all I'm feeling like I'm getting is sold, or when that's all it is. And I think I see and hear a lot of partners talk about that. And I get it's a tough world, right? You guys have quotas. You have to make your numbers. Sales is a tough gig. Security sales is exceptionally difficult, right? Especially in the VAR or SI world. But I want somebody that's actually going to be a partner and wants to be there and collaborate and is willing to bring resources to bear to help me understand a problem or the market or the landscape and can really do that effectively. And I might not buy something right then. I might not buy something from you, but that partnership and that relationship is much more valuable to me than I can call up anybody to push paper. That's not what I need, right? I need a partner that can actually bring some expertise and some outside perspective and can help me understand really what's going on in the market and what others are doing. Rarely is a cold call going to get me. If you're a cold call or a cold email, probably not going to get me that way. And I just am not likely. There's too many other things that need my attention.
Yep, totally agree there. No, I love that. And it's difficult for reps to stand out and teach a CISO something, right? Especially around security, that you're the expert more than the reps. But sometimes the reps do have actual relevant value around use cases and scenarios that they're seeing outside. So I agree, they need to come with actual value and teach and coach, which is hard to do, but the good ones do it. Just like the best CISOs out there focus on the tools, but they also focus on the people. The good sellers focus on both the people and the tools. And you said something that struck me, and I want to make sure we point this out, right? This podcast is around humanizing identity, and it's around the human side of it. And you actually said two things. The first, and this is going back our conversation 20, 30 minutes ago, when we were talking about access requests. You're the first CISO I've ever heard, you're the first security professional I've ever heard say this, that the risk is not overextending access or giving the wrong access. The risk is disrupting the employee's daily work. If that showed me, okay, you're caring about the person, and that's the first risk. That's a huge differentiator, Scott, the way that you think. And I love that. That's human first. That's people first. I absolutely love that. That stood out. The other thing that stood out is just when you were talking about building relationships with vendors, and you said sometimes that becomes personal. And I think the very best leaders and the very best salespeople become your personal friends because they are so authentic and so real. And you may not ever buy from them, and you can still become their friends, and they would be your friends. That really stuck out to me. I think it's so important in business you don't need to be my best friend and speak at my wedding, or I'm not expecting that type of personal connection, but personal connection matters. Even at the CISO level, personal connection genuinely matters. And so thank you for pointing those two topics out. I wanted to make sure that we went back to those because those really stuck out to me on this call. So thank you for that.
Jim, I was the last point on the personal connection. I think it's a little bit about trust, right? And so if I constantly feel like you're trying to sell me, I have to have my defense. I feel like I have to have my defenses up all the time, right? Or I'm always on guard because I'm feeling like I'm going to have to, do the dance about why I'm not buying something from you right now. Versus if we're just having a conversation, talking about problems, solving problems together, sharing, the defenses come down and there's more. That's where trust is built, right? You don't do that, but when you're in I got to make sure I'm ready to do the dance and explain right now. And so that's where that connection comes up. And yeah, you're right. I think about it. That's where those more personal connections have come from too, which makes sense when you think about it. I don't know that I had ever really connected it that way either.
If I'm local in Minnesota, I'm taking you ice fishing if I'm a vendor. We're going ice fishing. I know you're into golf in the summer, but ice fishing is the true as we started. So
That's a good way to start a relationship and build trust. It makes a real good icebreaker.
Yeah.
I didn't even plan that one, Aaron. That was I think, Scott, we got a lot of information. It was really helpful to hear you talk about some of the passions and some of the ways that you go about doing your business. I really appreciate you walking through that. And I just want to reiterate that all good CISOs are doing a lot of these things, but the very best CISOs focus on the human side. And thank you for being a human focused CISO. So we appreciate that and really appreciate you coming on to our podcast. Thanks, Scott.
Yeah. Thanks for having me. I really appreciate it as well. I think I'm I may be in the CISO chair now. I started my career in security and identity. And so I'm an identity nerd at heart too. I still have a passion and a soft spot for identity, and just have this strong feeling that it is such a difficult area. And so appreciate the opportunity to come on and just chat and pontificate about whatever else comes up related to it.
We'll have to have you back on in the future.
Sure. Be happy to. Thanks, gentlemen.
Thank you for joining us in this episode of Authenticate This, the Cybersecurity Leadership Podcast. Check out the show notes for links and resources mentioned in today's shows. If you enjoyed the show, please leave us a 5-star review and be sure to subscribe so you don't miss on any future episodes.